My son, Robert, left me in the remote Alaskan wilderness to die, believing my $1.4 million would be his inheritance. He was wrong. I survived, and I built an irrevocable trap that ensured his greed cost him every single penny forever. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The brochures hit my desk like accusations, glossy photographs of split-level homes with snow-capped mountain views, financial projections printed on heavy paper, the numbers promising a return I knew would never materialize. My son, Robert, spread them across my ledger with the practiced enthusiasm of a salesman closing a deal he'd already celebrated in his mind. "Dad, this is exactly what Cassie and I need." His voice carried that rehearsed confidence, the one I'd heard 2 years ago about the franchise, and again about the consulting venture, and most recently about the online business that required just a small investment. "The market's perfect right now, and this property will triple in value within 5 years. I just need $50,000 to secure it." $50,000. The number hung in the air, heavy and blunt. I removed my reading glasses slowly, setting them beside the calculator I'd been using before he arrived, unannounced, at my accounting office on the first day of September. Outside my window, Anchorage moved through its afternoon rhythm, traffic crawling toward the mountains shadowed against the cool sky. Inside, my only son waited for me to become the solution to problems he'd created himself. "You said something similar about that franchise opportunity 2 years ago." I kept my voice measured, the tone I used with clients who couldn't balance their books. "I lent you $8,000 then. That money never came back, Robert. Neither did the explanation you promised." His jaw tightened. The enthusiasm drained from his face like water through cheap fabric, replaced by something harder, something I was beginning to recognize. He leaned back in the chair, arms crossing defensively. The glossy brochures suddenly seemed irrelevant between us. That was different. The franchise had unexpected costs. "Everything has unexpected costs," I said. I pulled open my desk drawer, removed the ledger I kept for personal accounts. The leather binding felt familiar, a tactile anchor in the rising tension. My fingers found the correct page without looking. 2 years of documentation, promises recorded in my own handwriting, dates when repayment was supposed to begin. "You told me 6 months. Then it became a year. Then you stopped returning calls about it entirely." Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor loud enough to make the framed CPA certificates on my wall rattle. He gathered the brochures with sharp, angry movements, shoving them into the folder he'd carried in like a shield. "You're sitting on hundreds of thousands while your son struggles." The accusation came out bitter, practiced. "Cassie works herself exhausted trying to make our house presentable. Her parents help them. Real families support each other." The phrase, "real families," hung between us like smoke, stinging my eyes. I thought about my wife, Sarah, gone 5 years now. She would have known exactly what to say to bridge this gap, to find the balance between support and enabling that I couldn't seem to locate anymore. "You know what her father did." Robert pressed forward, voice rising, heat flooding the small office. "He gave them $30,000 for their down payment, $30,000 without hesitation, without lectures about responsibility." That's what real support looks like. Real responsibility means honoring your commitments. I stood to meet him at eye level, though at 62 my back protested the sudden movement. "I'm not a bank, Robert. I'm not an ATM machine, and I won't fund your lifestyle choices when you can't manage what you already have." The silence stretched between us like a canyon. I saw a micro twitch in his jaw, the telltale sign that the salesman facade had completely dissolved. He stared at me with an expression I couldn't read, something beyond simple anger. Something cold and calculated that made my stomach tighten like a knot. He dropped his voice to barely above a whisper, which somehow made it worse than shouting, sharper, more deliberate. "You're going to regret this, Dad." His eyes, normally a warm hazel, were flat now, dark water over stones. "You won't always be the one controlling everything. Things change, people change." The words weren't a prediction, they were a declaration of war. He turned and walked out. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the glass. I listened to his footsteps recede down the hallway, the sound of the outer door closing, and then the silence felt heavier than any argument. I sank back into my chair, the scent of expensive paper and desperation lingering in the air. I reached for the photograph I kept beside my monitor, a camping trip from when Robert was 16. Father and son on a ridge near Denali, both of us grinning at the camera Sarah had held. Robert's smile in that photo was genuine, uncomplicated by money or resentment. Things change. People change. His threats circled my thoughts like vultures. The drive home felt longer than usual. Traffic moved sluggishly, but my mind was trapped in that cold office confrontation. I parked in my small, practical driveway, a house paid off a decade ago. That independence had always felt like security. Tonight, it felt like isolation. Inside, the silence pressed against my ears. I made coffee, but couldn't focus. I wandered through rooms that felt emptier since Sarah's death. I stopped in the hallway at a photograph of Robert as a teenager, holding a massive salmon he'd caught on the Kenai River. Somewhere between that boy and the man who just threatened me, something had fractured beyond repair. I went to the garage, the sanctuary of my organized life. My camping equipment hung on pegboard hooks, GPS unit, satellite phone, water filter, all organized with the same precision I applied to accounting. I was too rigid, maybe. The thought arrived uninvited. Maybe Cassie really did push him, and he felt cornered. But the unpaid $8,000 wasn't about being strict. It was about pattern. It was about character. 3 days later, the feeling of cold certainty had settled in. I knew Robert wouldn't call back to apologize for the debt. He would only escalate the demand. I was halfway through a bachelor dinner of chicken and steamed broccoli when the phone rang. Robert's name appeared on the caller ID. I set down the knife, wiped my hands, and let it ring twice before answering. Dad. His voice sounded completely different, warm, almost vulnerable. I've been thinking all weekend. I was out of line Tuesday, way out of line. I said nothing, waiting. The silence was the only leverage I had left. I let Cassie's pressure get to me, let my own frustration control my words. I'm sorry. I want to make this right. The apology landed like something fragile. I leaned against the counter, trying to reconcile this tone with the cold threat of 3 days ago. Remember those camping trips we took near Denali when I was 15? Robert continued, the sound of his voice softening, a smooth river stone. Those were the best times, Dad. Just you and me. No distractions. What if we did that again? A week, just us reconnecting. I need that. I think we both do. Denali. The word triggered memories of ridgelines and caribou migrations, of teaching him to read topographical maps by firelight before money became the language between us. The hope was a sharp ache in my chest. The caution was a low hum in my gut. Denali is a long drive, Robert, 5 hours each way. I kept my voice cautious. The Chugach Mountains are an hour away. Good trails, good camping. Why go so far? Because Denali meant something, Dad. His response came quick, earnest. That's where we were closest. That's where I need us to be again. We leave Friday morning. I stood staring at the half-prepared dinner, phone pressed to my ear. Part of me heard warning bells clanging wildly. Part of me remembered that photograph on my desk, the genuine smile, the uncomplicated joy. Part of me was just tired of being alone. I chose hope over cynicism. All right, I heard myself say. Let's do it. After we hung up, I stood holding the silent phone, staring at it. Maybe sons deserve second chances. But as I walked to the garage later that night, pulling out my well-worn packs and checking my gear, the cold, calculated threat in Robert's voice echoed one last time. You're going to regret this, Dad. And I knew I needed to choose between a father's trust and an accountant's due diligence. The coffee shop Robert suggested was downtown, all exposed brick and industrial lighting. He was already there when I arrived on Monday morning, 2 days after the call, trail maps spread out like battle plans. Dad, he stood, a practiced, easy smile. Got you a black coffee. No sugar, right? I accepted the coffee, the gesture feeling calculated, but I accepted it anyway. I sat down, pulling my own topographical map of the Chugach Range from my jacket pocket. Robert, the Chugach is solid wilderness. Eagle River Valley has everything we need. Streams, wildlife, privacy. We could leave Friday morning, be camping by lunch. Why drive 5 hours when we have good terrain an hour away? He leaned forward, hands interlaced, the body language of earnest confession. Dad, it's not about convenience. His voice carried a weight I desperately wanted to believe. Denali is where you taught me to really see Alaska. Remember that ridge where we watched the caribou migration? That's where I felt closest to you. That's what I need now. That's what we need. The Caribou Ridge. I remembered it. Robert at 15, binoculars pressed to his face, counting animals flowing across the valley. He'd been so focused, so present, before the weight of his own financial failures had set in. I studied his face, searching for deception, finding only what appeared to be vulnerability, a well-polished act, or genuine remorse. The clock on my work schedule was already ticking. I had a major client audit due Friday afternoon, but I'd cleared it for this. I had paid the price of time. Here's what makes sense, Robert continued, pushing my Chugach map aside, spreading his Denali maps in its place. We take my truck. It's newer, better clearance, more reliable, and my camping gear's all upgraded. Modern tent, new water filtration system, comprehensive emergency supplies. Why duplicate everything when mine covers us both? The logic was sound, practical even, designed to eliminate any need for my own older equipment. It was a subtle, soft pressure that felt like the tide coming in. Your equipment's reliable. I kept my tone neutral, a testing device. You've tested the water filter, the stove. We'll be remote, Robert. Cell coverage disappears. We need functional gear. Dad, trust me, huh? He maintained eye contact, unwavering. I've used this setup a dozen times. Everything works perfectly. Trust me. 2 words that shouldn't require saying. We spent another hour discussing routes, supplies, timeline. Friday departure, 10 days away. Enough time to clear my demanding client schedule, prepare properly, and silence the tiny voice of suspicion. Robert took notes in a leather-bound planner, listing items with an organizational precision I hadn't seen from him since he was in college. Maybe he was changing. Maybe responsibility was finally taking root. The following days passed in a routine rhythm. Clients needing tax advice, quarterly reports requiring attention, the steady pulse of work that gave structure to my solitary life. But evenings found me in the garage, not working, but reviewing skills I hadn't used in years. I practiced starting fires with flint and steel, my hands remembering movements before my mind did. I pulled field guides from shelves, reviewing edible plant identification, fireweed shoots, the distinctive leaves of wild celery. I was preparing for a camping trip, but my instincts were preparing for a test. Robert sent texts, packing lists, recommendations. Keep it light, Dad. Minimal redundancy. We don't want to haul unnecessary weight 2 miles to camp. I stood in my garage the night before departure, holding my GPS tracker. The device fit comfortably in my palm. Familiar weight, proven reliability. My thumb hovered over the power button. I could turn it on, slip it into my pack, have navigation backup regardless of Robert's assurances, but that would be choosing suspicion over trust, cynicism over hope. I placed it back on the shelf. My satellite phone sat beside it. Bulky, outdated, but functional. Emergency communication that had saved me once when Sarah twisted her ankle 3 days into a Kenai Peninsula hike. I reached for it, hesitated, then withdrew my hand. Robert said his gear covered us both. Sons trying to reconcile with fathers shouldn't face automatic doubt. I packed what he'd specified. Lightweight clothing, minimal toiletries, a small knife, basic first aid supplies. My pack felt incomplete without the safety equipment I normally carried, the gear I'd accumulated across decades of Alaska backcountry experience. But reconciliation required compromise. Trust required risk. I loaded everything into the passenger seat of my old truck, ready for the early morning drive to Robert's house. I paused at my front door, looking back through the hallway toward the garage where my GPS and satellite phone remained on their shelf. Something felt slightly wrong. Not wrong enough to cancel, not wrong enough to justify suspicion, just wrong enough to notice the cold air seeping in beneath the closed door. Sons deserved second chances. The mantra felt heavy, a burden of proof I had to carry for him. Fathers who refused second chances weren't fathers anymore. I locked the door and went to bed, setting my alarm for 5:30 a.m. Tomorrow, Denali. Tomorrow, reconciliation. Dawn came cold and clear. I arrived at Robert's house just after 6, the sun barely clearing the Chugach Peaks. His Ford F-150 sat in the driveway, newer model, dark blue paint reflecting morning light like a promise. Perfect timing, Robert said, emerging from his garage. He loaded gear into the truck bed with quick, efficient precision. We'll miss the worst traffic heading north. I transferred my pack from my truck to his. The truck bed contained more equipment than I'd expected. A modern tent, cooking supplies, and what looked like a comprehensive emergency kit. Maybe my concerns about his preparedness had been unfounded. I watched him check the locks on the truck cap, a small gesture, but one that spoke of careful, professional organization. A true survivalist, I thought, a small wave of relief washing over me. The George Parks Highway unrolled before us. Robert drove with relaxed confidence, one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally gesturing as he talked about work. The development company landed this massive contract last month, luxury condos overlooking the inlet. His enthusiasm seemed genuine, unforced. My commission structure means if I close 3 units, I'm looking at serious money. Real money, Dad. The kind that changes things. I noted the recurring emphasis on money, but I let it pass. He wasn't asking for anything, just sharing. That felt like progress. Past Talkeetna, civilization thinned to scattered homesteads and then nothing but wilderness. Spruce forest pressed close to the highway, mountains looming white and massive in the distance. Robert's phone lost signal gradually, bars disappearing one by one until the screen showed only the emergency icon, a small, bright red detail that registered deep in my mind. There it is, Robert pointed to a turnoff barely visible through the trees. Our access point. We parked at a trailhead marked only by a weathered wooden post. No other vehicles, no signs of recent use. The isolation felt total, complete, exactly what I'd once loved about Alaska backcountry. Today, it felt different, heavier. The hike in took 90 minutes, 2 miles through dense spruce following a trail that required experience to track. Robert navigated confidently, checking his phone's ghost GPS images one last time. We emerged at a clearing beside a stream that ran clear and cold over rounded stones. This is perfect, I dropped my pack, surveying the site. Level ground, water access, natural windbreak from surrounding trees. Same basic area we camped when you were 15. Same area, Robert confirmed. Different spot. That old site's overgrown now. We set up camp with coordinated efficiency. We drove tent stakes while he strung the bear bag line between 2 sturdy spruce trees. The movements felt comfortable, familiar, like muscle memory from decades of outdoor experience finally finding common ground again. That first evening passed almost peacefully. We cooked over the campfire, freeze-dried meals reconstituted with stream water. This was a good idea, Robert. The words came easier than I'd expected. Being out here, away from everything, it reminds me why Alaska matters. Why this kind of quiet matters. Me too, Dad. He poked the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. I forgot how much I needed this, needed us. The second day, we hiked deeper into the wilderness. Ridgelines offered spectacular views, mountain ranges stretching to the horizon, valleys carved by ancient glaciers. The scope of wilderness made human concerns feel appropriately small. Robert photographed everything with his phone, still catching occasional signal bars at higher elevations. But that evening, the mask slipped. We'd finished dinner, settled beside the fire as darkness closed in. Robert had been quiet during the meal, his earlier enthusiasm fading into something harder. You know what Cassie said last week? He didn't look at me, just stared into the flames. She said her father gave them $30,000 for their down payment. $30,000 without hesitation. That's what real support looks like. That's what family does. The temperature between us dropped like a stone through ice. Cassie's father also isn't still waiting for $8,000 his son borrowed and never repaid. I kept my voice level, controlled. Real support isn't throwing money at people who won't take responsibility. I taught you better than this, Robert, or I tried to. He stopped mid-breath, went completely still. Then he stood abruptly, his face shadowed and unreadable in the firelight. He stared at me, not with anger exactly, but with something cold and calculated that made my stomach tighten, a distinct physical premonition of danger. Yeah, his voice came flat, distant. You tried. A long pause followed, the fire crackling, wind moving through the spruce branches overhead. I'm tired. We'll talk in the morning. He walked to his tent without looking back, the zipper closing with a sharp final sound. The reconciliation was a facade. I understood that now, but I didn't yet understand the full price of that realization. I sat alone beside the dying fire, watching sparks rise toward stars barely visible through the clouds moving in from the west. When I woke the next morning, the silence was not peaceful. It was empty. Robert should have been up already, rebuilding the fire, boiling water for coffee. The absence of sound felt deliberate, a hole in the morning. I unzipped my tent slowly. Dawn light filtered through the spruce branches at an angle that told me it was later than usual, past 7. I stepped out barefoot onto cold ground that made me wince. Robert's tent was gone. Not collapsed, not packed carelessly. Gone completely, as if it had never existed. Only flattened grass remained where it had stood 20 feet from mine. The fire pit held nothing but cold ashes. I walked the perimeter of our camp, my chest tightening with each detail. Every trace of his presence had been systematically removed. I turned toward my backpack, still leaning against the log where I'd left it. It was slightly tipped, the main flap not quite closed the way I'd secured it. I dropped to my knees beside it, my hands moving through pockets and compartments with increasing urgency. My small knife was there, but the GPS navigator was gone. My satellite phone was gone. The lighter I'd packed was gone. My spare trail map was gone. Most of the shared food supplies were gone. What remained felt like mockery. My sleeping bag, 2 protein bars, a half-liter water bottle, a tiny sewing kit. On a flat rock beside the cold fire pit sat a folded piece of paper weighted down by a stone. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The handwriting was Robert's, neat, unhurried, the script of someone who'd taken his time composing his message. I read it aloud to the empty forest, my voice flat with shock. You always said the tiger teaches survival. Time to remember those lessons. Maybe then you'll understand what's more important, money or family. If you return, we'll talk differently. If I return. The conditional phrasing was the murder weapon. He had planned this, every smile, every story, even last night's argument. When I refused him one final time, he made his choice. My son chose to leave me here to die over $50,000. Rage flooded through me so intensely that black spots danced at the edges of my vision. I crumpled the note in my fist, then forced myself to smooth it out, fold it carefully, and place it in my pocket. Evidence, even if only for myself. I walked toward the direction of the trailhead, 2 miles through dense forest. I knew with absolute certainty that the truck was gone. The isolation was total, 50 miles, maybe more, between here and the George Parks Highway, the main road that could take me back to civilization. 50 miles of wilderness with no navigation, no communication, no fire starter, minimal food, and water that would last perhaps 1 day if I stretched it impossibly thin. The temperature would drop to 40 degrees tonight. I had a sleeping bag rated for 50 degrees and a small knife. I walked back to camp and forced myself to sit on a log, controlling my breathing. Shock wouldn't save me. Rage wouldn't save me. Only clear thinking would keep me alive. Robert thought I was just an accountant who took comfortable camping trips, someone whose wilderness skills were decorative rather than functional. He forgot where I learned those skills. 30 years of Alaska backcountry before he was born, before mortgages and client files. He forgot that I taught him everything he knew about survival, which meant I knew more, which meant he'd underestimated me completely. I stood, retrieved the water bottle, took a single measured sip. 1 capful, no more. Then replace the cap with deliberate care. That careful conservation marked something shifting inside me, from victim to strategist, from shock to cold calculation. Robert made a mistake leaving me alive. He made a bigger mistake underestimating what I could do when survival became the only option. If I die out here, he inherits everything anyway, I thought, the irony a bitter chemical taste. But I wasn't going to die. The nearest road ran south. 50 miles, 3 days if I moved smart, 4 if I was weak, 5 if I made mistakes. I wouldn't make mistakes. First problem, navigation. I pulled my toiletry kit from the backpack. Soap, razor, tiny scissors, and there, overlooked by Robert in his systematic looting, a single sewing needle barely an inch long. I sat by the stream. The small knife blade became a magnetizer, stroking the needle repeatedly in one direction. 20 minutes of patient repetition, friction, and ferrous metal, physics I'd learned 40 years ago and never forgotten. I filled the bottle cap with water, carefully floated the magnetized needle on the surface, and watched it slowly align itself north-south, wobbling before settling. I scratched an arrow on the cap's edge, marking south. Crude, imprecise, but functional. I shouldered my pack and began walking. The first day stretched into eternity. Dense spruce forest where sightlines extended maybe 30 yards. Uneven ground studded with roots and hidden beneath moss. I checked my improvised compass every 30 minutes, adjusted course, and kept moving. 1 capful of water every 2 hours, precisely measured despite the thirst that became a constant screaming noise by afternoon. 15 miles. That was the goal. 15 miles before darkness forced me to stop. The first night nearly killed me. I built a lean-to from fallen branches and evergreen boughs. My hands remembered the work, even as my brain struggled with exhaustion. I crawled into my sleeping bag, wearing every layer of clothing. The temperature dropped far below 40 degrees. The bag was rated for 50. I ate 1 protein bar with agonizing slowness, making each bite last, letting the synthetic chocolate dissolve on my tongue. 400 calories to fuel a body that had burned thousands. Hypothermia crept in through inadequate insulation. I forced myself to shiver actively, generating heat, fighting the dangerous lethargy that whispered, "Just rest, just sleep, just stop struggling." I thought about Robert, warm in his house, believing his father was dying in the wilderness he'd abandoned him in. That white-hot rage kept me warm enough to survive. Dawn came eventually, everything hurting. I forced myself up, forced myself to move, because stopping meant dying. The second day brought small mercies. Wild blueberries grew in a clearing where sunlight penetrated the canopy. Alaska's brief summer had ripened them perfectly. I ate carefully. Too many would cause stomach problems I couldn't afford, but the sugar provided energy. Afternoon brought me to a shallow stream. I waded in the water barefoot, the cold shocking away exhaustion momentarily. Hand fishing. 3 attempts over an hour yielded 2 small grayling, maybe 6 inches each. I hesitated only briefly before eating them raw. Protein, essential calories. The texture made my stomach lurch, but I forced them down. The third morning, I stumbled onto a dirt road. I dropped to my knees in overwhelming relief, the first emotional break since reading Robert's note. I allowed myself 2 minutes of closed-eye breathing, then stood. The road was primitive, rarely used, but roads led somewhere. An hour later, I heard an engine. The pickup truck that appeared around the bend was old, but well-maintained. Dark green paint faded by weather. It slowed as it approached, pulling to a stop 20 feet away. The driver climbed out. Ben Carter, a man in his late 60s, a former park ranger. "You all right there?" Concern was evident in his tone. "You look like you've had a rough time. How long you been out here?" I straightened despite exhaustion, accepting the water bottle he offered, but drinking slowly, controlled. 3 days. I kept my voice steady, crafting the story even as fatigue pulled at my thoughts. Got separated from my camping group near Denali. Navigation equipment failed. Had to walk out. "You headed toward Anchorage." Ben extended his hand. "Former park ranger. I'm heading back from a hunting trip. Climb in." The truck's passenger seat felt impossibly comfortable. Ben didn't press immediately, just drove, letting me collect myself. 3 days, he said eventually. That's serious country back there. You're lucky. Most people panic, make bad choices. You kept your head. Old habits, I accepted the credit while deflecting attention. I've done Alaska wilderness before. Just never planned on testing those skills quite so thoroughly. We drove in companionable silence for a while. Then I asked the question that had been forming since I'd found Robert's note. Question for you, Ben. You worked for the Park Service. What happens legally if someone abandons a person in wilderness? Hypothetically, just curious about Alaska law after this experience. He glanced at me, reading between the lines with the skill of someone who'd spent decades dealing with tourists and their half-told stories. Depends on intent. Accidental separation? Nothing. Deliberate endangerment? He paused, the truck engine humming. That's Alaska Statute 1141.3 and 30. Reckless endangerment. Hard to prove, though. You need evidence of intent. I had evidence. A note in my pocket written in my son's handwriting. The 5-hour drive gave me time to think, to plan, to understand what came next. Robert thought I died out there. Thought he was inheriting everything. He didn't know I was alive. Didn't know I was coming home. Ben Carter dropped me at my house around 2 in the afternoon. We exchanged numbers. Take care of yourself, David. He gripped my hand firmly. You survived something most people wouldn't. That means something. It does, I agreed. Thank you, Ben. I stood in my driveway, watching his truck disappear around the corner. 4 days ago, I'd locked that door, believing I was going camping with my son. Now I understood what my son had actually planned. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The kitchen felt pristine, alien. I showered methodically, scrubbing away grime and sweat and the physical evidence of survival. Changed into clean clothes, khakis, button-down shirt, the uniform of the accountant. Looking in the mirror, I saw someone who appeared unchanged, but my eyes were harder than they'd been 4 days ago. The Anchorage Police Department occupied a municipal building downtown, concrete and glass, the institutional architecture of bureaucracy. I entered through the main doors at 3 o'clock, approached the desk sergeant, and stated my business calmly. I need to file an incident report. Wilderness emergency resolved. Officer Wallace met me in a standard interview room. Table, chairs, recording equipment on the wall. Mid-40s, experienced enough to read between the lines, professional enough to let me tell it my way. Mr. Gibson, he opened a notepad. You said wilderness incident. 4 days ago, I went camping near Denali with my son Robert. We became separated. My navigation equipment failed. I walked out 50 miles over 3 days. I'm reporting it now for documentation purposes. I slid Robert's note across the table without dramatic presentation. Wallace read it slowly, his expression not changing, but something shifting behind his eyes. Mr. Gibson, I'm documenting this as a wilderness incident with safe resolution. But this note, if you return, that phrasing suggests your son expected you might not survive. Are you certain you don't want to pursue charges? I'm certain. My voice stayed level, controlled. I'm reporting facts. What happens next is my decision. He filed the report, gave me an incident number and a copy of the documentation. I folded the papers carefully, placing them in my pocket beside the note I'd carried out of the wilderness. From the parking lot, I called Michael Preston. We'd known each other professionally for years. I handled tax work for some of his estate planning clients. His secretary initially resisted the urgency. Tell him it's David Gibson and it's urgent. Tonight, if possible. Michael came on the line 30 seconds later. David, what's wrong? I need legal advice, estate planning, trust work. Can you meet this evening? Something in my voice convinced him. 7 o'clock, my office. Preston Law Group occupied the 5th floor of a downtown building. I took the elevator up at 6:55, entered the reception area, and followed Michael into his conference room. I sat down heavily, allowing exhaustion to show for the first time since Ben had dropped me off. 4 days ago, my son drove me into remote Denali wilderness, took my navigation equipment, communication devices, and supplies while I slept, and left this note. I placed it on the table between us. He abandoned me 50 miles from the nearest road. I walked out. Michael read the note, read it again, and looked up at me with shock replacing his usual professional composure. David, this is serious. This language, time to remember those lessons if you return, suggests premeditation and acknowledgement of danger combined with taking your equipment. This is Alaska Statute 1141-330, reckless endangerment, possibly attempted murder if we can prove intent. How long would prison be? I kept my voice flat, professional. 5 years, 7. Then he's out. He's young. He rebuilds his life. Probably 6 to 8 years for reckless endangerment with aggravating factors. No, I interrupted him. I want something permanent. I want him to live with what he did every single day. I want to create an irrevocable trust. Every asset I own goes to charity when I die. He gets nothing. Ever. Michael set down his pen carefully. An irrevocable trust is exactly that. Irrevocable. Once established, you can't change the beneficiaries. Even if you reconcile with Robert later, even if circumstances change, you'd be permanently disinheriting your only child. Good. I met his eyes without hesitation. That's exactly what I want. How soon can you draft it? He studied me for a long moment, a lawyer's assessment searching for doubt or instability. He found neither. I can start tomorrow. But David, what exactly do you have in mind? I leaned forward, pulling a small notebook from my pocket. I'd bought it between the police station and here, and began explaining. 2 parts to this. First, the trust. Every asset, my business, my savings, my house, everything goes into an irrevocable trust. Total asset value. Business appraised around $385,000. Savings $850,000. House equity roughly $180,000. Call it $1.4 million total. Beneficiaries are Alaska charities, environmental groups, wildlife conservation, wilderness preservation. The very wilderness he tried to weaponize against me. Michael was taking notes, his legal training overriding his shock. Substantial corpus. And the second part? I want him to know while I'm alive. I tapped the notebook. I want to see his face when he realizes what he lost. I'm planning a dinner. Witnesses present. You as legal authority. Officer Wallace from the police as law enforcement. Ben Carter, who rescued me, as third-party verification. I present the note publicly, explain what happened, and announce the trust. He confronts the consequences before credible people. No room for denial. Michael frowned. I understand the appeal, but confronting him publicly is risky. He could become violent. He could claim you're mentally unfit. It creates legal complications for you. He left me to die and went home to wait for inheritance news, I said, my voice hardening. He needs to understand he failed completely. I need you to ensure this trust is foolproof, legally irreversible, and that he hears that permanence directly from your mouth. Michael looked at the note, then at me. It will be permanent, David. If you sign this, that is the end of the line. Your son will never receive a penny of this $1.4 million. The next morning, Michael Preston started drafting the trust. I spent the day gathering documentation, corporate papers for Gibson and Associates, bank statements, property deeds. Decades of organized records, meticulously filed in my home office, were now being consolidated for one purpose. Every piece of paper represented a brick in the permanent wall I was building between Robert and my life's work. The business valuation took a week. A professional appraiser, a man named Henderson, visited my office, reviewed client lists, examined revenue streams, and interviewed me about succession planning. The irony was a cold comfort, discussing succession while actively ensuring my only child wouldn't succeed to anything. Your firm has an excellent reputation, Mr. Gibson, Henderson noted. Clean books, loyal client base. That stability adds significant value. I've worked hard for that stability, I said. I had guarded it with professional diligence, only to find the greatest threat came not from the market, but from my own blood. The appraisal came back at $385,000. Combined with savings and property, Michael's calculations confirmed approximately $1.4 million total. That's substantial generational wealth Robert is losing, Michael said when we reviewed the numbers. He made his choice in Denali, I replied, the phrase already hardening into a mantra. I'm making mine now. Evenings, I researched beneficiaries, Alaska Wildlife Conservation Fund, Denali Wilderness Preservation Society, organizations that represented everything Robert had tried to corrupt into a murder weapon. I felt a surge of cold, grim satisfaction. These charities will benefit from his greed, I explained to Michael. The wilderness he weaponized will be protected by the money he wanted. There's justice in that symmetry. I began executing the transfers immediately, signing authorization forms that moved $850,000 from personal accounts into trust accounts at the Riverbank and Trust. Each signature felt definitive. The bank vice president, Ms. Chen, looked concerned. This is a substantial transfer, Mr. Gibson. The trust is now one of our larger estate accounts. Good, I said simply. Business retitling took longer. Corporate documents were filed with Alaska's Department of Commerce, amended articles showing trust ownership while I maintained operational control as trustee. I sent formal letters to longtime clients explaining the ownership structure change, maintaining professional appearance while knowing the real, chilling purpose underneath. By late September, I legally owned nothing. The house, the business, every dollar, all trust property. I retained lifetime use rights, but nothing to bequeath. Robert's inheritance had been erased. The phone rang on the evening of the transfer. Robert's name on the caller ID made my jaw tighten, a physical reflex. I picked it up. "Hey, Dad." His voice carried a manufactured brightness that set my teeth on edge. "I've been thinking about you. That camping trip was great, wasn't it? You made it home okay?" I tried calling a few days ago, but no answer. "Everything good?" The artificial cheer barely masked nervous guilt underneath. "Yes," I said. One word, flat and cold. "I'm home." "Oh, good. That's good." Confusion crept into his voice, like ice forming on glass. He was struggling to reconcile my existence with the narrative he had written for himself. "We should get together soon." "Yes, we should." I hung up mid-sentence, sat at my kitchen table, staring at the phone. I imagined his expression on the other end, the uncertainty, the growing anxiety. Let him wonder. Let him worry. 4 days later, he called again. "Dad, look, you sounded strange last time we talked. Is something wrong? Did something happen on the trip?" I stood by the window, watching the streetlights come on. The world looked normal, but everything inside it had fractured. "Nothing's wrong, Robert. We'll talk soon about several things." "What things?" "Dad, you're worrying me now." "Soon." I hung up before he could respond. He was circling, a shark testing the water, sensing the sudden absence of blood. He hadn't won, and the consequences he thought he had escaped were about to become his only reality. 2 weeks after my return, early October now, Michael Preston called me back to his office. The conference room had been rearranged formally. A notary public, Ms. Thompson, sat at one end of the table. The trust document lay between us, 78 pages of dense legal language that would govern my estate forever. I sat down, feeling a strange mix of finality and dread. Michael walked me through the key sections, his lawyer's thoroughness ensuring informed consent. Page 12 establishes the irrevocable nature, he said, pointing with a pen. Page 23 designates the beneficiaries, the Conservation Fund and the Preservation Society. Page 47 specifies you retain life estate. You can use assets during your lifetime, but ownership transfers to the trust. Upon your death, everything goes to the charities. No provisions exist for Robert Gibson. He paused, looking directly into my eyes. No possibility of future modification. You understand this is permanent, David. Absolute. Final. The notary spoke with practiced formality. Mr. Gibson, do you understand this is an irrevocable trust? Once executed, you cannot change the beneficiaries, modify the terms, or reclaim the assets except as specified in the trust document. Do you execute this voluntarily? I do. My voice was steady, clear, completely voluntarily. I initialed each page, 78 pages of careful notation, an accountant's precision applied to a legal document. Then, the signature pages. My name written 3 times, witnessed, notarized, sealed. The notary stamped the final page. The sound felt definitive, permanent, like a vault door slamming shut on Robert's future. Michael collected the documents, placing them in a leather folder. It's done. The trust is executed and irrevocable. I'll file copies with the bank tomorrow, notify the trustees, begin the formal transfer process. I sat back in my chair, feeling not triumph, but grim completion, a necessary task finished. Thank you, Michael. The dinner confrontation. You're still planning that? Yes, 2 weeks from now. Enough time to arrange it properly. I leaned forward. We need to secure the police documentation again. I need that incident number on paper. Robert might try a soft campaign first, spreading rumors that I'm unstable, that the wilderness broke me. My mind, the strategist's mind, raced ahead. Officer Wallace must confirm the report was filed before the trust was signed. It validates my decision-making capacity. Michael nodded, making a note. I'll arrange a meeting with Wallace and Ben Carter. We need all 3 witnesses synchronized. 2 days later, I made the call I'd been planning. I stood in my home office looking at the Denali photograph on the wall, Robert's young face smiling at the camera. Robert, I want you and Cassie to come to dinner Thursday evening, October 20th, 7 o'clock. We need to have a serious conversation about family matters, financial arrangements, the future. His eagerness came through immediately, a greedy gasp. Of course, Dad. Of course, we'll be there. This is good. I'm glad you're ready to talk about this stuff. He thought I was surrendering, thought the wilderness had taught me his lesson about priorities. He thought I was inviting him over to hand him money. Will it just be the 3 of us? He asked, trying to sound casual, but the tremor was there. No, I let the word hang. There will be others present, people who should hear what I have to say. Others? What do you mean, who? The anxiety had returned, a cold tremor running through his voice. Thursday, 7 o'clock, don't be late. I hung up, allowing myself a cold, brittle smile. I called Michael next. The dinner's set for Thursday. You'll be there. Ben Carter and Officer Wallace, too. I want you to confirm the trust's legitimacy. He needs to hear from a lawyer that it's permanent. Public confrontation is irreversible, Michael reminded me. You can't take it back once done. That's the point, Michael, I said. He tried to make my death irreversible. I'm making his consequences irreversible. The trap was set. Now I only had to wait for my son to walk through the door. Thursday arrived, October 20th. I stood in my dining room arranging chairs, 6 places around the table, 3 on one side for the family, though I no longer considered Robert family, 3 on the other for the witnesses. I set out plates and silverware with accountant's precision. I placed a manila folder at my seat. Robert's note, the police report, the trust documents arranged in order. The stage was prepared. By 6:45 p.m., I did one final check. Robert, Michael, and Officer Wallace stood in my living room, understanding their roles as witnesses to justice. Ben Carter, the former park ranger, nodded solemnly. He'll arrive thinking I've surrendered, I told them quietly, smoothing the folder, that I'm giving him money. Let him keep thinking that until I'm ready. At 7:05, headlights swept across my front window. A car door slammed. Footsteps on the walkway. My pulse spiked. I opened the door before Robert could knock. Robert, Cassie, come in. They entered confidently, Cassie close behind, both dressed well for what they expected to be a pleasant family dinner, a victory lap. Their steps faltered when they saw the 3 men standing in my living room. Friends, Robert's forced smile didn't reach his eyes. Dad, I thought this was family dinner. It is. I walked toward the dining room. These are the people I consider family now. Michael Preston, my attorney, Officer Wallace, Anchorage Police, Ben Carter, who saved my life when you left me to die. Robert's face drained of color, the transformation startling and immediate. Cassie clutched his arm, confused, her eyes darting between the witnesses and Robert's suddenly pale face. He looked like a statue carved from ice, rigid with sudden dawning terror. I gestured to the dining room table. Shall we sit? The seating was deliberate, Robert and Cassie on one side, the 3 witnesses facing them, me at the head of the table, presiding over the execution of his future. I retrieved the manila folder, opened it methodically, removed Robert's note, unfolded it, and smoothed it flat on the table where everyone could see. It was the only artifact of the wilderness I needed. Your words, Robert. My voice stayed steady, accountant's tone presenting facts. Dad, you always said the tiger teaches survival. Time to remember those lessons. Maybe then you'll understand what's more important, money or family. If you return, we'll talk differently. I looked up, met his eyes, allowing no flicker of pity. If I return, you acknowledged I might not survive. You left me 50 miles from the nearest road with no navigation, no communication, minimal food, and water in wilderness where nighttime temperatures dropped to 40 degrees. Dad, it wasn't... Robert's voice shook. You're making it sound worse than it was. It was supposed to be a lesson. Character building like you always talked about. I knew you'd make it out. You're experienced. I left you enough supplies. You left me enough to watch myself die slowly. The words came out ice cold, delivered with surgical precision. You took my GPS, my satellite phone, my map, my fire starter, everything that meant survival. You wanted me dead. Cassie's hand covered her mouth, horror dawning on her face as she looked at her husband. She hadn't known, not the full calculated extent. Robert tried to stand again, a desperate final flinch. I only wanted what was fair, he whispered. You had to be taught a lesson. I was taught a lesson. I produced the trust documents, slid them across the table. Here's what I learned about what's important, Robert. This is a notarized, irrevocable trust document. I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on him like a gravestone. Every asset I own, my business valued at $385,000, my savings of $850,000, my house worth $180,000. Total corpus, $1.4 million, is now permanently held in trust. Beneficiaries, Alaska Wildlife Conservation Fund and Denali Wilderness Preservation Society. Upon my death, these organizations receive everything. I watched his face as the magnitude of his failure began to penetrate the shock. His inheritance, the goal of his attempted murder, was now the permanent property of the very wilderness he used as a weapon. You can't! Robert started to stand, hands gripping the table until his knuckles were white, breath coming in ragged gasps. You can't do this to me. I can verify, Michael interjected professionally, his voice cutting through Robert's rising panic. This trust cannot be modified, revoked, or challenged. It was signed and executed, witnessed and notarized before this confrontation. It is legally permanent. You receive nothing, ever. Robert sank back into his chair. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. Cassie had started crying, a silent, betrayed sound. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that follows a bomb drop. I stood, pushing back from the table. You asked me what's more important, money or family, I asked, my voice ringing with finality. I've learned the answer. The wilderness you tried to make my grave will benefit from your greed. The $1.4 million you tried to inherit through my death will protect the place you weaponized against me. I walked to the front door and opened it. The family I thought I had was an illusion. The cold air rushed in. I have no son. I have no family. But I do have friends. People who helped me survive what you did. People who witnessed justice tonight. I stood beside the open door. Now leave my house. Robert and Cassie rose like automatons. He looked shattered, his face pale, his movements mechanical. He walked past me, eyes unfocused, a ghost of the confident man who had entered. Cassie followed, her expression suggesting she was already mentally divorcing herself from the man who had abandoned his father to die for money. They walked out into the night. I closed the door firmly, locked it, the click of the deadbolt a small, satisfying sound. When I returned to the dining room, Officer Wallace spoke first. Mr. Gibson, with this evidence and these witnesses, we could pursue charges. Reckless endangerment under Alaska Statute 1141.330. Possibly attempted murder. I shook my head. Prison would be temporary. 5 years, 7. Then he's out and rebuilds. This is permanent. I looked at the three men who had helped me execute this final chilling act of justice. Every day for the rest of his life, he'll know he tried to kill his father for money and lost everything instead. Ben Carter raised his coffee cup in a quiet toast to survival and justice. Michael and Wallace joined him. So did I. Not triumph, not celebration, just cold recognition that consequences had finally met actions. Robert had tried to write my ending. Instead, I'd written his. The wilderness hadn't killed me. His greed had killed any possibility of redemption. I sat with the three men who'd helped me survive and watched as evening deepened into night, feeling nothing but the quiet satisfaction of a life secured and a debt paid in full. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.